In 1981, a witness claimed she saw the brutal murder and cremation of a woman underneath a tree on a stretch of deserted farmland. But there was no trace of the remains anywhere nearby, and investigators were stumped. For answers, they turned to the science of forensic geology. Marshall, Illinois is a small farming community just across the Wabash River from Terre Haute, Indiana. The rich soil feeds vast fields of corn and acres of soybeans. Before she disappeared, Charlotte left several notes in a safe deposit box in the local bank. In the notes, Charlotte accused her husband of stealing some farm equipment and said she didn't think she would live through a divorce. She said she was afraid of Fred and also his friend and business associate, Dale Kessler. When police interviewed Dale Kessler, he said he was home on the night Charlotte disappeared and that Fred Grabby had been with him. When a grand jury asked Fred Grabby about his whereabouts on the day Charlotte disappeared, he invoked his Fifth Amendment rights and refused to testify. With no evidence of a crime, the official investigation stalled. Charlotte Grabby became yet another missing person. Despite a $25,000 reward posted by the Grabby children, Charlotte and Fred immediately began to argue and soon turned violent.
From what Vicki McAllister told us, Fred actually choked Charlotte several times and then would let up on the pressure and let her regain consciousness and then would choke her again, making comments to her the whole time.
Vicki said that after Grabby choked Charlotte to death, he sodomized her. Afterwards, he used a grease gun to fill every orifice of her body to make it more flammable. He then put her body in the trash barrel and headed towards the river. Vicki drove Charlotte's car and abandoned it over the state line in Indiana. Later that night, Fred doused the body in diesel fuel, and while Vicki watched, Fred burned the body. The fire lasted throughout the night. Eventually, only Charlotte's skull remained. Grabby threw it in the Wabash River, saying that it would make good fish food. He then rolled the barrel into the river.
The story, when you hear the whole thing, it's really kind of hard to believe.
McAllister's tale horrified Charlotte's daughter.
It was almost overwhelming. Of course, I cried a lot, and over the course of the next few days, it had to sink in because there just was so much to it, you know, and it was so horrific, as you say. I just kept praying that my mom didn't go through any pain.
McAllister had plenty of motive to tell a story that would put Fred Grabby in prison.
There's no greater wrath than that of a spurned woman. She may have originally been concerned with a long-term relationship with him that lasted for a certain period of time and then it ended. And then I think she was angry.
Vicki came to expect, if not be told, that she would share in the dynasty, the financial dynasty of the Grabby family, that she would become a part of everything, and that she and Fred would live happily ever after. I mean, that's the story that guys tell girls, and girls often believe.
In exchange for her testimony, Vicki McAllister was offered total immunity, relocation, and a new identity. And if Grabby was convicted, McAllister could claim the $25,000 reward offered by the Grabby children.
Well, anytime you have just one person's word against another, it's always better to have some type of physical evidence.
But there was another living witness to the events of that terrible night 3 years earlier. And that evidence would tell if Vicki McAllister's story actually had the ring of truth. Fred Grabby's ex-girlfriend, Vicki McAllister, took police to the scene of the crime. The diesel fuel in the soil would have long been washed away.
We took some soil samples and they were negative for petroleum products.
But one piece of potential evidence survived: the maple tree under which the funeral pyre allegedly burned.
Trees make excellent history books because they show us when events occurred nearby the tree. They can explain to us exactly when different events happened.
In this photo, Sheriff Crumrin is standing on the spot the barrel was allegedly placed. Was there any way for science to corroborate Vicki McAllister's story? In the spring and summer, roots transport water and nutrients from the surrounding soil up through the trunk and into a tree's branches, where they fuel the growth of very large cells. When the tree goes dormant in late summer and fall, it produces smaller, more dense cells. This cycle produces the familiar rings we see when we cut a tree branch or trunk. Each ring indicates another year has passed. If the tree absorbed diesel fuel from the gruesome funeral pyre, was there any way to tell?
Diesel fuel is a toxic material to trees. It will either kill the cells or it will affect their growth rate, their metabolism, adversely. When it's absorbed by the tree, it will slow the growth rate of the cells that it's in contact with.
Investigators cut 5 branches from the tree, and when they counted back through the growth rings, they saw something startling.
In 1981, the growth of those branches had dramatically slowed from what it had been in previous years.
Growth rings from the year Charlotte disappeared were much thinner than earlier rings, but there was no way of knowing why this was so. To find out, pieces of each branch were ground into sawdust and given to Dr. Donald Dickerson, an organic chemist. Dickerson dissolved the samples and injected the sample into a gas chromatograph. The results indicated the presence of hydrocarbons, compounds indicative of petroleum products. Even more startling, only 2 of the 5 branches showed traces of petroleum, the ones on the side of the tree where Vicki McAllister said the cremation took place.
Samples on the other side of the tree were negative for hydrocarbons.
Some species of trees will translocate or carry the material laterally around the tree better than others. Maple trees in general tend to maintain fairly direct columns between the roots and the branches above.
A unique for carbons in the maple tree next to where Charlotte Grabby's body was allegedly incinerated, Fred Grabby was arrested and charged with murder. The star witness was Fred Grabby's ex-girlfriend, Vicki McAllister, who was given immunity to testify. Her story both fascinated and horrified courtroom spectators.
The first time I think I heard about the tree was when it came out in court. And I thought, wow, you know, that really, to me, proves Vicki was telling the truth about everything.
The motive? Money. Fred Grabby had no desire to split the family assets with his wife, even though it was Charlotte's inheritance which comprised the bulk of their holdings.
Most of the farm ground that they had, it's my understanding, belonged to her through her side of the family. And Fred was going to lose a lot of money, basically. That's what it all amounted to.
If the love of money is the root of all evil, the roots of a maple tree soaking up errant diesel Jeff and Cindy had built next door burned to the ground. Arson investigators discovered both fires were deliberately set.
Oh, I believe Fred Grabby probably had some involvement with it. Not in setting the fires directly, but I believe he probably had some involvement. But we'll never know, probably.
Fred Grabby's lawyers appealed the first verdict.
The maple tree, alive and growing, was one thing, one creation that Fred Grabby could not intimidate, could not reach, could not destroy.